sad anniversary. 50 years ago, April 4, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. In Indianapolis, where Robert Kennedy was campaigning for president, the crowd was unaware.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in.
This year, we, the high school class of '68, turn 68. As chaotic as 2018 seems, it's hard to imagine all we witnessed 50 years ago happening in 1 year. In 1968, there was never a time Vietnam wasn't on page one. This picture won the Pulitzer Prize. It was the first TV war, and in 1968, we saw Khe-Sanh and the Tet Offensive in our living rooms. North Korea seized the USS Pueblo. The Winter Olympics were in Grenoble, France, and there were clenched fists at the Summer Games in Mexico City. On television, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In helped us escape reality by confronting it. Also debuting 50 years ago, 60 Minutes. And the movies didn't shy away either. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and Planet of the Apes tackled race. Dustin Hoffman was The Graduate, confused about what next. On Broadway, Hair. The Beatles' #1 song was Hey Jude, and the #1 LP was their White Album. Dr. Christian Barnard performed the first successful open heart transplant. The Boeing 747 made its maiden flight. NASA launched Apollo 7, the first manned Apollo mission, and on Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 circled the moon. Denny McClain threw 30 wins, and his Detroit Tigers, down 3-1, won the World Series. After Gene McCarthy gave LBJ a scare in the New Hampshire primary, Bobby Kennedy got into the race, and the president got out. Watching Kennedy's announcement on TV in California, candidate Richard Nixon said, "Something bad is going to come of this. God knows where this is going to lead." Kennedy was shot moments after declaring victory in the California primary. At a Democratic convention that turned violent in Chicago, Hubert Humphrey and Edmund Muskie were nominated. In November, Richard Nixon was elected. In 1968, Yale began admitting women. Jackie married Aristotle Onassis. Charlie Chaplin and Helen Keller died, and Celine Dion and Will Smith were born. Gas was 34 cents a gallon, a movie ticket was $1.50, and the minimum wage was $1.60. McDonald's introduced the Big Mac, 49 cents. President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. 50 years after Dr. King's death, and a 1968 that makes 2018 seem calm by comparison, where are we? Let's ask attorney, professor, activist, minister, and former Minneapolis NAACP president, Nekima Levy-Pounds. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
50 years after Dr. King, what is better now?
Well, I would say that a number of things are better. If you look at the situation that was occurring in the South, prior to the start of the Civil Rights Movement, there were Jim Crow laws in place that prevented African Americans from being able to access certain facilities, to eat at certain restaurants, to drink at any water fountain they wanted to, or even to use the restroom where they wanted to. And so through the activism of Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and so many others, we saw an end to Jim Crow laws, particularly in the South as well as some parts of the North. We also saw the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act, none of which would have been possible were it not for the strong advocacy and activism and lasting legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
And 50 years later, what is Dr. King's unfinished business?
Well, unfortunately, there is a great deal of unfinished business. Dr. King was in the process of launching a Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. That was actually supposed to happen in April of 1968. He saw the intersections between race and class and the struggle for equality in this country, and he wanted to push for a basic income for all Americans, affordable housing, universal health care, and to make sure that life was more equitable for all people, and particularly people of color. So we know that although the Poor People's Campaign happened to some degree after Dr. King's assassination, the impact was nowhere near the vision that Dr. King had. And so we see that poor people across the country are still being impacted as a result of inequitable access to opportunity and affordable housing and things like that. Beyond that, we saw the proliferation of mass incarceration in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination as a result of the war on drugs. And since the war on drugs began, we've seen an increase in the number of people being incarcerated, the number of people being on probation or supervised release, and we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world right here in the United States, where approximately 1 in 100 people are currently incarcerated, with an estimated 2.3 million people overall who are serving time in our nation's jails or prisons. I don't know that Dr. King could have imagined that the system of mass incarceration would be introduced in the aftermath of his assassination. Additionally, we look at how many poor people and people of color are behind bars and how that is a negative aspect of what happened after the movement.
Often the news is discouraging. Are you optimistic?
Well, I'm optimistic because of the Black Lives Matter movement and allies around the nation who have stepped forward to bring attention to issues of mass incarceration and police violence. I hope that that continues and that pressure continues to be applied to government officials so that change can take place. But we have such a long way to go to achieve the dream that Dr. King articulated so many years ago.
Thank you, Nakima Levy-Pounds. We also asked some folks who were visiting Dr. King's memorial here in Washington.
His legacy is very long-lasting, and because of it, minorities can enjoy the freedoms that we get to enjoy in this country. He's probably not the sole reason, but he's a major reason why we can.
It was really something very special that he did.
He did a lot, but I'm sure if he was around, there would be more things that I think he probably would have been able to do.
He probably became president at one point.
He stuck with his legacy and everything he fought for and everything we were trying to pursue, and he had the drive of the people. It was just trying to get everyone together, and I think if that continued, it would have definitely changed where the world is at right now.
There were so many things that happened during his lifetime in the positive towards African Americans that maybe people thought, well, we're done here.
I think that you'll see a lot of the cop shootings and things we have going on in today's society. I don't think that would necessarily be happening.
Back in the day, there was still a lot of police violence, and there was still a lot of things going on that's going on today, but it's not as much as it was before. Like, they're increasing, and I feel as though that if Martin Luther King was still here, then we'll hear his voice, we'll hear his speeches and his marches, and we will still have that today.
When somebody that is that sharp and that smart, and they shorten their lives, eventually we all do something.
I think it's not only America, right? It's like a global problem. Yeah.
In Mexico, we have Indians and our natives, but No, it is not as bad as it is in here.
We would have more of a presence in terms of the black community. Yes.
This country had a black president for 8 years. I think there was a good amount of people that did not like that.
You just look how far we came now, and it's still progress going on, but just know, like, what you have in life can be different tomorrow just by one thing you do each day in your life.
What's happening now is a byproduct of the silence that we've experienced for the last 50, 60 years.
Why do you think that silence is out there? Why do you think people are silent?
Because we don't have any more MLKs. You know, everybody, it seems like today is looking out for personal gain rather than their fellow man and the person next to them.
Jessica Ann Mitchell Iwuyor is an award-winning poet, writer, and activist. You read her, among other places, in the Huffington Post, and her blog is OurLegacy.com. Jessica?
Just before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he was organizing with sanitation workers as part of the newly launched Poor People's Campaign. He was known as the voice for change, for progress. Yet he feared that he had integrated his people into a burning house. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, Dr. King recognized that America had a critical issue that must be dealt with in order to substantially uplift the masses. It was the issue of economic justice. In fact, he called it the most serious problem confronting the Negro and poor people generally. 50 years later, overt segregation is mostly a thing of the past. There are no whites-only signs above water fountains and park benches. However, today, millions of Americans face poverty due to a lack of living wages and a historically flawed economic system that values corporations over people. Meanwhile, affordable housing is scarce. Segregation persists through redlining. Gentrification is displacing marginalized communities across the nation, with racism intertwined in all of this. Dr. King's analysis of America's race and economic problems hauntingly remains true. It is now up to our current and future generations to ensure that grassroots and youth-led movements continue to be a guiding force for social justice and restorative change. We can fulfill his dream with persistence, eventually.
That is The Big Picture. If you missed any part of this week's show, or if you want to share it, you can, where you'll find all our shows, youtube.com/thebigpictureRT. I'm Holland Cook in Washington. Happy Easter, happy Passover, brace yourself for April Fool's Day, and welcome back baseball. I'll be back next week. Meantime, question more.